Hi guys, hope everyone's well and welcome back to the Improvement Podcast. So in this episode, I'm going to touch on what all effective programs involve. The reason why I'm creating this episode is many training styles work, which has been proven time and time again. Not everyone trains the same, but a lot of people have built pretty decent amounts of muscle, to say the least. And like all training styles have their differences. They have their potential pros and cons. And obviously, a big part of what training style you use is what you enjoy, because if you enjoy something, you're going to put more effort in it, you're going to stick to it long term. So that's something very important. However, all share some similarities and fundamentals. All the ones that I'd say on paper are the most effective. So I'm going to go over what basically makes a training split or a training program effective. And the reason being is this will allow you to then, regardless if you like training the same way as I do, just make sure you've got the fundamentals in place. That's important when it comes to programming, because these are like the base things that it needs to include if you're wanting to maximize your progress. So, in terms of the first thing I'm going to touch on, it needs a progressive stimulus. So, stimulus just meaning a stress on the target muscle, and you need to have one that's progressible over time. Because if you don't have a stimulus that you can progress, if you don't, let's say, add more weight to the bar, or if you don't do more reps, or if you don't do anything to make it harder, then you will look the same. We need to apply progressive overload over time. And if we do lift the same load, we'll just not really be able to progress our physique much. So, load is something that you should primarily progress, in my opinion. And a good training split will do so, because load is infinitely progressible to an extent. And what I mean by that is you can only do so much sets, whereas you can keep progressing load and load without running into a barrier, without running into a wall of how much sets you can do. Because if you keep adding sets and you're just going to become some person who trains for endurance, you'll do too much sets that you can recover from. So I primarily like progressing training through adding load. And all training styles, you might not do it week to week, but from block to block, you will need to be getting stronger on your movements. And in terms of like RIR training, failure training, or any other method, that will be the case. It doesn't matter if you train reps in reserve or to failure. RIR, as I just went over, stands for reps in reserve. Both work, as I said, both styles can work, and many training styles work, but they need to have these fundamentals. And the reason why we need to be progressing load is because mechanical tension is the main driver of muscle growth, which simply means tension on the muscle, load on the muscle is the main driver for muscle growth. So we need to increase the tension over time. If you don't increase the tension, if you lift the same, you'll look the same. Simple as that. And in terms of something to be mindful of is when we say, or when I say mechanical tension needs to be progressed, that's the main driver of muscle growth. That's the main cause of it. In other words, we need to increase the tension on the target muscle. We don't need to increase load just on its own, because we could increase weight, but that doesn't necessarily mean there's more tension on the target muscle. For example, if your form changes and you've not put more tension on the target muscle, you've lifted more, and you've lifted in a way that's more efficient so you can lift more, not a way that targets the desired muscle better. So be mindful of that. We're aiming to progress the stimulus, not progress the load. But of course, load will progress over time. But that's not what we want to do. It's not just adding load to the bar, because our muscles don't know if we're lifting 100 kilograms on the bench press or 102.5 or 110. It knows how much load is being placed on it due to the positioning of your joints. So that should stay the same, as well as our rep speed on the way down. In terms of the next thing that all effective programs involve, it's appropriate amounts of volume. So enough volume to basically yield results when it comes to your training. And what I mean by volume is I'm referring it to as how much sets and reps you do. And you can't get away with just doing, let's say, one set per exercise. And the reason being is it's just not going to be an appropriate volume to progress long term. You might, let's say, if you never trained before and you do one set, then you might make a wee bit of progress if you train ridiculously hard, but it's not really going to it's not effective, put it that way. So we want to basically have an appropriate amount of volume. And we want enough that it's effective, but not too much that we can't recover. So something I've touched on before is someone called Mike Criswell. He's got a theory, or not a theory, like I'd class it as a theory, where you get minimal effective volume and maximal recoverable volume. You want to be somewhere in between it. You want enough so it's effective, but you don't want too much that you can't recover from your training on a week-to-week basis, so that you can still progress long term. Because it doesn't just matter what we do session to session, or it doesn't just matter what we're doing in that session. It matters what we're doing session to session, week to week. So we want to be able to progress long term and not be too fatigued from our training. So we don't want to do too much volume that we can't recover. Too much volume could look like just too much fatigue, physical, mental tiredness accumulated throughout the weeks, or it could look like just carrying too much soreness going into the next session, which could impact performance and also increase injury risk. So what I mean by this is doing 100 sets for legs, probably too much. Doing one set for legs, probably too little. We want to be somewhere in between. We want to be doing an appropriate amount so that we can do an effective amount. So we're getting a good pump. We're getting maybe some soreness, not that we need it. We're getting a feeling of tiredness in that target muscle, but by the time we get to our next session, we're recovered and we're ready to perform well and progress our sets again. That's what we're looking for. And I'm not here to tell you how much sets to do, because a lot of things will influence that, like how often you're training, like your training effort, and like let's say your quality of your execution, your experience levels. I'm not sure if I said that. Like your lifestyle outside the gym, how active you are in your job, your stress levels, and your consistency with your training, and like your nutrition. And as a result, I can't say, right, do X amount of sets. So that's just not really a feasible thing to say. But it also depends. Like, so basically, just I've got an episode on like volume as well. So maybe give that a listen. But basically, we want to do enough so that we're feeling like it's effective and we don't feel like we're under training. Like if you feel like you can do more and recover from it before the next session, do more. Don't see any reason why not, unless it's like already a really, really, really strong and dominant body part for yourself. So yeah, make sure you're doing an appropriate amount of volume. Next up is fatigue management. So as I commented on earlier, fatigue is physical and mental tiredness, and we can accumulate fatigue through training hard, training consistently, and the more weight we lift, the more fatigue we basically accumulate. And fatigue is something we want to drop now and then, because when we accumulate too much fatigue, that will impact our ability to progress. Because when we are too fatigued, we can't recruit as much muscle fibers, we can't recruit as much motor units, which basically means our performance will be poorer. As well as that, sleep can be disrupted, digestion can be poorer, our motivation to train will be down, injury risk is higher, inflammation in the body will be higher, all things that are going to have a negative effect on our training. But we can avoid fatigue, because progressing is fatiguing, but we should manage it. And it's not as important to manage as a beginner, because you can't train as intensely as someone really experienced and you're lifting less. So like you're like someone who's lifting, let's say 40 kilograms on the deadlift, they don't need to deload after 6 weeks, because that's not a substantial amount of weight to accumulate fatigue, compared to, let's say, someone benching 100 kilos. They are going to accumulate a lot more fatigue. So the stronger you are, the more you need to pay attention to it. But basically, you want to pay attention to mitigating fatigue in some form. If it's taking like 4 to 7 days off, if it's doing a devolume week, if it's just training with less intensity for a week. And like I said, this most likely isn't going to be needed for the majority of the beginners, but this is something you'll have to like consider and make sure you put in place over time, especially as you get more experienced. And in terms of like throughout the training block, so throughout your training, you don't just want to mitigate fatigue every so often when you need to like back down, deload when fatigue's too high. You want to be mindful of how much fatigue you're accumulating. Like I said, if you do too much sets, you're going to be battered before your next session. You're just going to carry too much fatigue. So you want to be mindful of like your movement patterns and like what you do in each session, because you can't just, let's say, do 10 sets of deadlift, 10 sets of squats, 10 sets of leg press, then 10 sets of rack pulls, 10 sets of hip thrusts. Regardless if you've got like muscle soreness, you won't be able to recover from that from a systemic fatigue point of view, from a central nervous system fatigue point of view, which is what I'm on about. So we need to manage that, because that's just going to mean you're going to write yourself off and perform poor in your next session. Next up, effective programs have like movement patterns that are repeated. So not that 100% of, let's say, the movements you need to repeat, but I'd say a large percentage you should be repeating, because the bread and butter movements, the main movements, we want to basically get efficient at them, and how we do so is repeating them. If we don't repeat movement patterns, if we don't repeat movements on a week in, week out basis, we don't get the ability to get efficient at them and get strong at those movements. And the reason being is, when we basically get efficient with practicing it, and if we don't practice it often, just like anything else, just like any other sport, how are we supposed to get the technique right? You're going to feel when you do the movement that you can't balance well, that you can't stabilize the weight, it just feels foreign. You don't know when to stop in terms of your depth. You don't know where to put your elbows if you're pressing or pulling. It will just be a bit all over the place. You can't judge when, let's say, the machine or bar is going to hit the ground or hit the safeties, and it's just going to feel very foreign and unfamiliar and new, just like we've started lifting. But when we do it week in, week out, it becomes like brushing our teeth. We become very efficient at it. We don't really have to think about execution, and from there it's a lot easier to progress it. And we might argue, like, but when I do a movement, it starts to slow down. I don't progress it as fast if I keep repeating it. When you first put a movement in, it will fly in terms of progressions, but it then will slow, and that's inevitable, because the first progressions, the speedy ones, is just getting efficient at the movement pattern. After that, we will still progress, but just at a slower rate, and those progressions arguably are going to be more beneficial than adding 5 kilos on the bar from week 1 to week 2. And the reason being is, they're the ones you really have to fight for. They're the ones when you're already at peak strength and you slap more weight on and you match your reps. That's the ones that's building more muscle tissue, in my opinion. Being able to do that and repeating that process, being at peak strength and getting even stronger. Because if you're not at peak strength, if you're just progressing a movement fast because it's new, then that doesn't really yield much reward in terms of muscle growth. And in terms of why we also want to do it, like I said, we want to be applying progressive overload, so it allows us to track, see if we're actually applying progressive overload on a weekly basis, because if we're not doing the movement consistently, we can't see what we are doing. We can't see what we done last week from like our logbook or whatever, so we can't then look upon it, assess that, and then progress. We're not able to do that if we're not doing the same movement. And we want to be applying progressive overload because it means we can increase the mechanical tension, as I said earlier, and as a result, grow muscle much more effectively. And next up, when you're a beginner as well, you want to basically repeat movements frequently, because when you're not skilled at a movement, like I said, you don't perform well. So the more you can repeat it, the more skilled you'll get at a faster rate. Just like when you do a sport, you practice the basics first and do that frequently just to get skilled before doing anything else, really. Next up, we want to ensure our training suits our lifestyle. And this might seem a weird one, you might not expect it, but it should be sustainable and fit into your day-to-day life. Everyone's got different commitments, so you shouldn't basically copy Jay Cutler's program. Or Jay Cutler, for those that don't know, he was a bodybuilder. He's retired now, but I know one point during this contest prep, he was training 2 times a day, weight training, and doing 2 cardio sessions. Someone with a 9-5 job, 2 kids, and like pets probably shouldn't be doing that schedule, because they won't be able to sleep well. They won't be able to recover from it. They can't just sleep in between each meal and have the same low stress levels. So you want to basically have something you can stick to, from a time point of view, enjoyment point of view, and one that doesn't cause unnecessary fatigue for your ability to recover. So when it's sustainable and when it suits your lifestyle, you'll be able to progress, because sometimes people are a bit afraid to do less. But if, let's say, you're not recovering from what you're currently doing, then doing that amount's not going to yield you more progress than doing less. When, let's say, I get my clients to do less work for whatever reason, it's not because I want them to get less results. Although you think more sometimes better, it's because I want them to get more results, to be able to recover effectively so they can progress their sets. So you don't want to be causing unnecessary stress and missing workouts frequently. So next up, we want it to suit individual needs. And this is my last point, unless any spring to mind. But basically, as you get more advanced, you have like or it's more of a priority to make sure your training's tailored to your individual needs, because as a beginner, everything's a weakness. You've got not a lot of muscle everywhere, without saying that in a rude manner, but it's true. How can you be like, right, I really need to bring up your biceps when you've got very little muscle throughout your whole body? You need to bring up everywhere, and then you can spot weaknesses. It's hard to really spot weaknesses if you've not got any body parts that are really developed. So as at the beginning, what you basically want to do is just get strong at big movements, and then after years of training, you might then see weaknesses arise. But for the first few years, I'd at least focus on just nailing those basics, and then you will eventually get to a time where you might need to give some body parts a bit more attention than others, meaning they might need more volume, or they might need more sets and reps, or that is volume. Yeah, they might need sets and reps, or they might need, let's say, to be put at the start of the session when you're physically and mentally fresh, so you can put more effort towards them and make the most of your sets a bit more, or basically any other way that's going to improve the work that you're currently doing. Until then, though, you should pretty much batter everything as frequent as you can recover from. And what I mean by that is you should train every body part as much as you can physically recover from, and just repeat that process. And again, prioritize those big lifts. And before, this is not as, oh, I'd say this is related. This is a good point, actually. When we are wanting to bring up a lagging body part, the first thing we should do is make sure our execution's good. Because if, let's say you are squatting and you've got weak quads, and you're squatting in a way that doesn't target your quads well, doing more sets of quad or doing more sets of squats grow your quads. Maybe a wee bit. Will it would it grow them as well as if you nailed your form to target your quads as best as you possibly could and then add more sets? No, it will definitely not progress more than the second option, because if you're targeting a muscle poor, adding more sets is just going to be more poor or more movements with more sets with poor form. For another example that's probably a bit better, is if you're targeting your back, when I train my back anyway, I like to split up to focusing on targeting my lats, which is a muscle that goes from your armpit down to the bottom of your spine that flare out, which look like quote unquote wings or whatever. Your lats are one muscle that's kind of hard to target for myself anyway, or was. I'm getting better at it now. And then you've got your upper back, which is just all the meat on your upper back. If you're doing, let's say, an exercise trying to target your lats, but you're targeting your upper back, and then you think, oh, my lats aren't growing, I will add more sets, but you're targeting your upper back with your form, then adding more sets is only going to keep growing your upper back and make your upper back more dominant, make your lats more of a weakness. So the first thing you should always address is your form. And that's something that is also very important for a program, which an effective program should include. It's executing exercises with good form. You could maybe get away without, but that doesn't mean it's optimal. That's not mean it's as effective as doing it with good form. You see people get very far with quote unquote poor form, and you can. What's most important is effort, really, but after that, if you want to maximize things, in my opinion, it's not just about effort. It's about effort and matching that with good form. Because, like I said, like when you see people who just like train hard with sloppy form, usually they have a weakness in their physique unless they're genetically blessed, or they can just connect very well with each body part with sloppy form. And if you can do that, you're probably very lucky. But yeah, and you're probably going to come across injuries less if you've got good form. You're probably going to get more out of your current sets, in my opinion. and not be sore, and have less fatigue and more stimulus from each set. So yeah, that's something else that all effective programs involve, in my opinion anyway. And in terms of what is good form, controlling the changes of direction, making sure you're executing the movement to target the desired muscle, making sure you are bracing when you need to, so that you've got the ability to produce more force, things like that, just to run through a few things. And if you're trying to isolate a muscle, keep the other muscles still. For example, if you're trying to train your shoulders during a lateral raise variation, you shouldn't be moving your chest excessively. You shouldn't be flopping back and forward like a fish. Or same applies if you're doing a leg curl. If you're doing a leg curl and your back's moving a ton, then that's just going to mean your back's being involved during the movement. That's going to take away from your legs doing the work, which we don't want, because it's a leg curl, not a back curl or a back extension or whatever. You're trying to train your legs, so your legs are the thing that should be moving, if that makes sense. Hope you enjoyed the episode. If you did, give it a like, share, subscribe, drop a message and let me know what you found valuable to it. And if you want to see any certain episodes or any certain guests on the podcast, then just let me know. And I hope you like the new podcast cover as well. I thought I'd give it a wee refresh because it was looking or it lacked a bit of professionalism with the cover that I made myself on Canva. So yeah, hope you enjoyed the episodes, and thanks very much for listening as always.